Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices in Solar Planning and Zoning, hosted by the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I am the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network and is partially funded by the U.S. EPA, Office of Community Revitalization, and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars such as today's Best Practices in Solar Planning and Zoning, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org. Your one-stop on the web for the most current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. We provide timely news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Clearinghouse on smart growth topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will post it on our website in the next few days under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest news and information about smart growth and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. In today's webinar, we will talk about best practices in solar planning and zoning, an emerging planning issue across the country and one that we in Maryland are also grappling with. So by way of introduction, our speakers today are Scott Annis, Brian Ross, and Megan Day. Scott is a program manager at the International City-County Management Association. He manages the designation side of the SolSmart program and other sustainability-focused programs. SolSmart is a community designation and technical assistance program that encourages governments across the United States to improve local solar policies and processes. His previous experience includes economic recovery and resilience planning, local and regional planning, and economic development. Brian Ross, who is AICP and lead GA, is project or program director at the Great Plains Institute. He has 25 years of experience working with local, regional, and state governments on sustainability efforts, including energy planning and renewable energy development practices. He helped develop state and national sustainability programs for local and regional governments. He's created solar development best practice toolkits and model solar ordinances for multiple states, helped to design the National SolSmart Certification Program, and co-authored the American Planning Association's Planning for Solar Energy Guide. Brian has assisted dozens of local governments with climate action planning, solar and wind siting regulations, and integrating renewable energy development into agricultural and natural resource protection programs. Megan Day is a renewable energy planner at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. She serves as the lab's subject matter expert on city energy planning and large-scale photovoltaic development. Megan provides technical assistance to communities across the country on planning and zoning for solar. Megan has conducted and published original research into the intersections between city policies and solar deployment and has led the development of a city energy profile for every U.S. city available on the state and local energy data site. Her previous experience includes utility scale PV development, nonprofit management, and climate action planning. Following the presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during the presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And I will note that there's been a heavy interest in this program and we've already received some questions ahead of time. For those of you who have those questions, if you can go ahead and submit them on the questions tool, we will be able to look at them during the presentation and ask them during the Q&A section. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Scott to get us started. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Michael. Before we go ahead and get started, we're actually going to conduct a brief little poll here, just 3 questions very quickly to kind of help inform who the audience is and some of the issues you're facing. Go ahead and start with the first poll. I can go ahead and show the answer for the first poll question. You can go to the next question. Great. Well, thank you, Michael. So before we go ahead and get started with the presentations from Brian on planning for solar development and Megan presenting on zoning for solar and land use planning, I want to give a quick overview of SolSmart program. So SolSmart is a Department of Energy funded program that aims to make it faster, easier, and more affordable for more Americans to choose solar. There's two main components of the program: technical assistance and designation. Technical assistance is provided at no cost to cities, counties, and regional organizations, and it's around 8 solar-related categories of the SolSmart program that I'll go over in a little bit. These solar experts will help review your local processes, identify areas for improvement, and provide an action plan of criteria that needs to be undertaken to achieve designation. Designation is bronze, silver, and gold levels, and is based off of the number of criteria or actions that are taken by a community. Achieving designation, you join the national prestigious network of designees, but it also signifies that you are open for solar business. The program aims to have at least 300 designees by October 2020, and at this point we're a bit ahead of track, but this is important to local governments because local governments actually help control one of the main goals of the program, which is to reduce soft costs. Soft costs, for those who are unaware, are all costs outside of the actual hardware, such as the solar panels or inverters. Soft costs can include permitting, interconnection, financing costs, customer acquisition, or installation labor. So the program really focuses on the permitting and interconnection costs and how cities and counties and regional organizations can help reduce that. As you've seen, since 2010, the actual hardware costs have gone down, but soft costs have actually remained high. So streamlining some of the local regulatory processes can reduce the cost by $2,500 of the system. And then looking only at permitting alone, fixing and correcting some of the onerous permitting procedures can save up to $700 for an installation. This can help actually increase the amount of solar deployment in the community, which can also then increase the number of jobs in the community. So it's a great economic development effort for some minor adjustments to local ordinances, planning, or zoning codes. Here are the 8 SolSmart criteria that we focus on. The foundational categories of the SolSmart program is under permitting, planning, zoning, and development regulations. And then there's 6 special focus categories. All these criteria and categories the TA providers can help the community walk through, but then once the community has achieved actions or already completed some of these actions in the past, the SolSmart program recognizes that and awards points. And then once a certain threshold of points is met, that's when the community can achieve the bronze, silver, or gold designation. So currently we have 236 designees throughout the United States. We're in 38 states, including the District of Columbia, and this covers over 65 million Americans. Now this map is available on solsmart.org, and so I encourage you to definitely go on and visit solsmart.org to see the communities that are currently participating, but also you can find out more information about the program and how to get started. There's an available Get Started button on the top right-hand corner where you can request a no-cost consultation, and that again is where one of our technical experts will set up a call with you to discuss your current local solar environment, answer any questions about the program, and get you started in the SolSmart program. So I'll answer questions at the end of this webinar, but you can also email admin@solsmart.org, and please do encourage you to visit solsmart.org. So thank you for your time. I'm now going to hand it off to Brian Ross, who's going to talk about planning for solar development.
So thank you. Sorry for that glitch. My name is Brian Ross with the Great Plains Institute. The Great Plains Institute is let's see. There we go. The Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit organization that works everywhere from the local scale up to the national scale on a variety of different issues. We have kind of 4 programmatic focuses, including energy efficiency and productivity, decarbonizing the electricity production system, electrifying the economy and adopting low carbon fuels and carbon capture and storage. We also have within that, as an implementation arm of that, our communities program that I'm part of, where we work directly with local governments, because most of these issues that we address, the actual implementation of it happens at the community scale. And if we're not engaging local governments and regional governments in the effort to achieve these goals, we are probably not going to achieve them. And so a lot of the work that we do at the implementation scale is actually looking at ways to help local governments achieve their own goals and to help us with these other larger scale things that we need to try to achieve. And so I wanted to just start with my slide that kind of sums up my entire presentation, and that is that good planning and policy at the local level really enable good development. And this is something you need to think about with solar development, that solar development is just another form of development in your community, and you need to really think about how it fits within your typical planning and zoning structures in order to make sure that you're getting the things that the community, are getting the things that you need to get out of that kind of development. Solar energy is an economically valuable local resource. This is something that wasn't necessarily true 10 years ago, but it is today, and it's something that you have to recognize, and your community needs to recognize that people are going to want to develop this resource, whether or not it's a priority of the community. So it's something that needs to be addressed as a local resource, just like you address other local resources in your planning. Because it is valuable, that development of these resources, you should make sure that it should benefit both the owner and the community. There are co-benefits that you need to strive to get to. There are design standards that should be adopted in order to capture community interest. And these are things that you need to take into consideration when you're doing not only your policy work, but also in your development regulations. And then finally, the local plans really lay the policy foundation for the development regulations and all the programs that enable capture of benefits while minimizing risks. And this is why we're starting here with the discussion about comprehensive planning and policy at the local level in order to make sure that that foundation is laid in a way that's going to allow you to capture those benefits. So why do we plan for solar development? Well, the cost of solar energy, and this is both large and small scale solar, has declined by over 70% since 2010. This has had a tremendous effect on the marketplace, and we're seeing solar development in places where 10 years ago no one would have imagined to see it, and we're seeing it be cost competitive in places that no one would have imagined. It is in fact competitive both in the wholesale markets and retail markets almost everywhere in the country. As a consequence of this, the Department of Energy is now predicting that by 2050 we're probably going to have well over 40 times the amount of installed solar capacity that we did by the end of 2017, just a year ago. And all of this, as I kind of mentioned earlier, happens in our communities. We tend to think sometimes that solar development is something that happens only in the desert Southwest or only in places like California, where they have the perception is they have a great solar resource, and they do. But the thing is, it will happen in all of our communities because it's cost competitive pretty much everywhere in the nation. In fact, I had a discussion fairly recently with someone who was insisting that as a practitioner in the upper Midwest, who was telling me that solar won't work in the upper Midwest. And then a week later, this news story came out about the Canadian government had signed solar power contracts, the regional government of Alberta, for a cost of 3.6 cents a kilowatt hour, which is extraordinarily low, which is cost competitive pretty much everywhere. And this is a project that's going up in Canada. There's this whole nation even north of us that has even a more extreme solar kind of weather patterns. It works there. If it works in Canada, it's going to work anywhere in the United States. And so I just wanted to emphasize that this is something that happens in all of our local communities, not just in places that are thought of as typical high solar resource areas. But as a consequence of this, the cost declines, we're really seeing a lot of cheers happening everywhere about the ability to decarbonize our electric system with solar and the kind of forecast solar that continuing price declines that we're expected to see. We're also seeing a lot of happiness about things about the economic development impacts of solar, kind of new value for property owners, residential homeowners, commercial business owners who now have an energy resource on their property that they can develop, as well as economic opportunities for large landowners and agricultural producers. Ways to diversify, for instance, agricultural operations by harvesting a different kind of resource than maybe you would have in just row cropping your land or grazing it. And similarly, at the community scale, we have the ability to map out what the economic reserve is. In this case, we're showing Rockford, Illinois, a solar reserve of over 1,000 megawatts of generating capacity just on the rooftops of this particular city. But this also leads to a flip side of development, and this is a series of headlines that I've seen come across from both local and regional newspapers just within the last couple of months. Solar proposal splits farmers and clean energy fans. The county solar project meets resistance, pushback over the county solar ordinance, residents worried about the solar farm and scenery. These are the kinds of things we're seeing now, which kind of points to this is a new development form. It does come with controversy and with some nuisances, but if you do your design and you understand the way that the options you have as a community to really kind of get ahead of this game, you can actually make these things avoid most of the controversies that are currently coming up. So, and all this is happening within our communities. The Great Plains Institute developed a series of local government toolkits. This is for just upper Midwest states, and this actually predates the SolSmart program, but I just kind of put this up here to let you know that there are a whole bunch of tools already out there that you can use and access for your particular communities. This is for the upper Midwest, but there are similar toolkits and model ordinances that have been developed nationwide, and the SolSmart program can really help direct you to the kind of tools and toolkits and models that can address the concerns that you might have in your particular state, because there is variation across states, both in terms of solar markets, in terms of solar resources and economics, and in terms of a regulatory authority that local governments have. I'm going to talk primarily, or rather, I skipped a slide here from my head, sorry. There are 5 solar-ready community principles that we talk about in our toolkits. These are consistent with the SolSmart program. And what it means to be a solar-ready community means that you're going to address the solar resources and encourage development in your policy documents, such as your comprehensive plans. You're going to address the varied form of solar in your development regulations, recognizing that rooftop solar and solar farms are 2 very different kinds of land use, and the same set of regulations should not apply to both of them. You're going to address solar in your permitting processes, your administrative processes, when you're issuing permits, building permits, electric permits, land use permits, other kinds of things, to make it predictable and transparent so there's a smooth process to move forward for the developer, and people on both sides of the counter understand what's needed. You're going to make public sector investment in your community solar resources on your city hall or your county public works building, and you're going to adapt your local programs, the kind of economic development programs that you most likely have in your community that limit, that address things like market barriers, and to enable private sector solar development that makes sense within your community. A variety of different things that you already have in place can be adapted to do that. So what I'm going to address primarily is the first of those bullet points, which is the solar-ready comprehensive plans and policy documents. And what we say you need to do in your policy documents to address solar is really 4 things. One is to identify and define the solar resources in your community. This is a mappable, measurable resource that you can actually quantify and identify geographically within your community, and look for things like land use synergies and land use complications. You need to acknowledge solar development benefits and the desired co-benefits that you want to achieve as a community. You need to identify solar development opportunities and conflicts in the community from a land use standpoint. Where does it make sense for this to go? Where does it make sense maybe to not allow it? And do so in a way that's consistent with your other policies and documents. And then finally, you need to set solar development targets or goals in your policy documents, just like you would other kinds of development options that you want to see, such as housing, such as job creation and economic development, such as infrastructure development. We frequently in our policy documents will set targets that then inform things like our capital improvement programs, so that we can look back and see whether or not we're succeeding or not. So I'm going to go through those 4 points here. And the first one of those is identify and define solar resources, kind of give you some examples of how this has been done around the nation. In the metropolitan area in Minneapolis and St. Paul, where I'm from, all 188 local governments in that area are required to address their solar resources as part of their comprehensive plans. The council has calculated the total and rooftop solar reserve for every single local government in the 7-county region, and has provided guidance for achieving solar goals and for the protection and development of solar resources, which is what the statute says, so that communities have some sense about how to do this, because obviously this is a new kind of land use and a new kind of resource that local planners are not always ready to address. Kind of an example of what this looks like at the local level is the city of St. Louis Park, for instance. Here is a map of that city, a suburban community in the metropolitan area right next to Minneapolis. The gross solar reserve of all solar resources, all economic solar resources within the community are about 940 megawatts of generating capacity. But that's every single economic resource, of course, which we're not going to develop our parklands and our roads probably with solar. But if we look just at the rooftop reserves in this community, there's about 216 gigawatt hours of potential electric generation that can occur, which is approximately 43% of the total electric energy use in this community. So you can see the size of the resource just for the rooftop reserve, and compare that in a way that makes economic sense and kind of gives a sense of magnitude of really what this resource is worth. The second point on comprehensive planning and policy is to acknowledge the benefits and co-benefits of solar development. Like other kinds of development, solar development provides community economic benefits. It creates jobs, it creates new markets for local contractors, it provides a diversity of income to landowners, particularly business owners and agricultural owners, and it also is a local kind of import substitution benefit from that as well for most communities, where you're able to substitute a local fuel for an imported fuel in terms of kind of the economic impact that you're getting. This is something that we talk about a lot when we talk to local governments. It's not an environmental benefit, but it's a co-benefit that is very distinct and has been measured pretty concretely. And an example of how that's been done is one of our SolSmart Gold communities, Pima County in Arizona. They actually created a renewable energy incentive district with specific sites and an incentive plan here to develop utility scale solar energy systems. They picked those lands which they thought were environmentally suitable in unincorporated Pima County, created these zones in order to kind of push the development to those areas, just like we would other kinds of development where we want to give it a priority in some areas and discourage it in other areas. So this is an example of how they did that and implemented their policy documents or policy goals within that county. The third point of the planning is to identify solar development opportunities and conflicts. And this is actually one where there's a lot of detail and complication that you need to think about. How do you ensure that solar development fits your community's land use goals? There's a lot of real conflicts between solar development and land use, and also some, as we generously say, perceived conflicts. that people raise frequently, but maybe have less grounding in reality than you might think. For instance, things about how does solar fit with agricultural practices and with agricultural protection that you might have in your community. What about urban forests? You have urban forest goals. Urban forests are great things. Rooftop solar is a great thing. They don't necessarily go well together. How do you balance those things in a way that makes sense with your communities? Historic resources. Are there guidelines and ways to do solar development on historic resources? Growth management. We have a couple of different examples of that, and I'll go into this in more detail later about how you achieve growth management goals and where solar may conflict or actually contribute to your growth management goals. Airports and other priority infrastructure are often thought of as places that we need to keep solar away from because there may be a risk, when in fact airports are one of the best places to put solar because you have lots of land that you don't want buildings on or people on, and it's a perfect place to put solar. You do have to meet FAA standards about making sure that there's not a conflict in terms of a glare study that you have to do, but it's actually a very good place to put it, and you need to sometimes maybe rethink the way you kind of integrate this, including things, as the last point says there, on natural resources where and natural areas where, again, solar development is frequently the knee-jerk reaction is to keep it away from natural areas because it's not a natural thing. But in fact, if you do your design right, you can actually create an area that has a lot of complementary benefit to some of your natural systems, and actually create an amenity and a buffer for your natural systems that is revenue producing. And this is kind of some of those design standards that we need to think about. Some of those natural resource conflicts and opportunities that we talk about, for instance, you can create in your design standards ways to make sure that you're having habitat value for your solar development, and this is for principal use solar gardens or utility scale, where you have used pollinator ground cover. A number of states, Minnesota was actually a leader in this. A number of states have now adopted standards for pollinator ground cover. This is something that I am an advocate for, that every community should have some version of requirement for this kind of ground cover for community solar gardens or solar farms. Water quality protection. You can actually create if your soil types are correct, you can actually create watershed benefits within your solar development by making sure that you're using, again, ground cover that has infiltration rates that are high, and that you're protecting areas with good soil infiltration for that kind of an amenity. You can integrate it with agricultural practices in a number of different ways. Megan is going to talk a little bit more about some of these things specifically. One of those things, agricultural protection, in terms of land use conflicts and opportunities that I wanted to touch on in a little more detail, is to understand really what those communities where you have agricultural protection goals or perceived conflicts between solar development and agricultural protection, is to understand what it is you're trying to protect with your agricultural protection. We actually have a number of different categories of agricultural protection that different communities use in different parts of the country. Out on the East Coast, we see a lot of emphasis on things like the limiting secondary development and limiting nuisances that are going to impact agricultural practices, which for the primary purpose of preserving the kind of rural character of those areas. And rural character is one kind of agricultural protection. In the Midwest, we tend to see a lot more emphasis on things like loss of prime ag soils. You can actually do solar development in a way that protects prime ag soils and limits the fragmentation of land for the benefit of agriculture, if those are your primary agricultural protection goals. So there's this gets into a little bit more complicated. I could do a whole seminar on this alone, but it's something that you need to think about when you talk about agricultural protection. It's not all the same thing, and you can do solar design in a way to really achieve that. One of the communities here in Minnesota that has done that in their comprehensive plan is Stearns County, a SolSmart Silver community, where they have a couple of comprehensive plan goals here, both to encourage renewable energy system development, solar and wind energy, because those reduce the footprint of development on local and global natural systems. But they also have a goal to protect agricultural natural resources, particularly the agricultural soils and other resources and they want to do that by regulating non-agricultural land uses in areas with agricultural soils. They have incorporated pollinator habitat requirements for every single solar farm or garden that goes into Stearns County, and I think they're up to about 60 or 70 megawatts worth of solar development in that county now. And that is a means that the corn producers and dairy producers have actually been happy with, because it provides a pollinator benefit that they're actually getting, they're benefiting from, even though it is taking some ag land out of production. So they have balanced between those two things and created a design standard in order to achieve their community goal. The fourth policy standpoint, policy goal is that you need to have is setting solar development targets in your policy documents. And here we looked at another SolSmart goal community of a town of Fairfield, Vermont, and we're looking at a sustainability plan rather than a comp plan. But they have specific targets that they put in here, both short-term and long-term. They have 2020 plan goals. 40% of the town electricity is from renewables. They want 500 residents with solar power at their homes, including some low income. They want to be able to support state renewable policies as an advocate and create large-scale clean energy projects as well. They have a long-term goal by 2050 that they set of 100% of energy in the town in all the different sectors are from renewable sources. There are different ways to achieve this. Megan is going to go into some of these things in greater detail. But I did want to touch on finally, since we're talking about smart growth here, so I kind of pulled down the Smart Growth America principles. There are 10 principles here, and there's a number of these that when you think about solar energy, how you might achieve these principles in the way that you do solar design and in your policy statements that you want to move forward. A mix of land uses. You can, in fact, have solar plus in terms of land uses. You can do solar plus habitat, solar plus water quality protection, solar plus natural resource buffer areas, as well in your principal uses, as well, of course, at the small scale where you're doing solar as an accessory use that serves in terms of a mix of land use, serves the use that is on site, the principal use on site. Another one that I was talking about earlier, preserve open space, farmland, natural beauty, and critical environmental areas. You can design and locate your solar farms in such a way that you actually preserve open space and farmland. We have some examples of communities where they specifically designed an overlay to go into places where they wanted to protect farmland because they wanted to give priority to the renewable energy development, which actually helps the farmer from an economic standpoint, and discourage housing out in those areas, because that, of course, housing in farmland areas is a problem in terms of creation of nuisances and a conflict of land uses. So kind of recognizing that solar is a good mix with farmland, if it's done correctly, perhaps better mix than housing is. And similarly, the SolSmart program on number 9, making development decisions predictable, fair, and cost-effective, is what the SolSmart program is about. So kind of on small scale solar and smart growth issues, we have cross-property solar access and redevelopment, infill, and densification goals that might be in your that you need to think about. Obviously, the picture over there on the right of an urban area where you have goals to increase density and to have a variety of different building heights could create problems with solar access. I mean, you need to think about that ahead of time and how you actually enable those kinds of infill and densification goals to move forward, while also providing some level of protection for solar access. Utilization of difficult to develop parcels within the urban fabric is something that we talk a lot about in terms of a smart growth goal within the urban fabric, and citing as I mentioned earlier, of integrating urban staging and growth boundaries in a way that a solar farm or garden may actually be a good thing to do in an urban growth boundary, because it's a 25-year land use, 25 to 35-year land use that can, at the end of its life, be turned into urban growth areas, because decommissioning is fairly straightforward. And similarly, at the large scale here, we talk about siting that integrates with this urban staging and growth boundaries and open space. Make sure there's a holding pattern for urban expansion. Recognizing that with solar, there's no infrastructure needs, so you don't have to extend infrastructure to it, other than, of course, an interconnection point where that may be needed. And recognizing that the kind of, as a developed land use, it has a financial pro forma that's shorter than almost other kinds of developed land uses, and it is far easier to decommission than almost any other kinds of developed land use that you have. And Megan will go into the kind of importance and aspects of low impact design for those areas. So I just wanted to close with recognizing that good plans enable good development. Solar energy is an economically valuable resource that is going to be developed in your community, and you need to plan ahead for it. Make sure that you're going to have that happen in a way that benefits the owner and the community, capturing both economic benefits and environmental benefits for the owner, but also for the community in terms of kind of the co-benefits that you can capture with good design, and to integrate these things into your local plans, because they provide the policy foundation for recognizing the capture of benefits and minimizing risks. So I am now going to hand it over to Megan to tell you about how to do this.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. So this is Megan Day with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and I am going to focus now on solar in your zoning code, and also some considerations for land use planning for large-scale solar. So just to start off with some attributions and disclaimers, I am working with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. We are one of 17 national labs. We're the only lab that focuses exclusively on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainable transportation. And NREL, as we're called, is actually in the SolSmart program. We are a technical assistance provider, and SolSmart is funded by the Department of Energy, which manages the system of 17 national labs. So let's move on to solar and your zoning code. Now, Brian talked a lot about how to integrate solar in your comp plans and policies. Let's move on to how to codify that. In my reviews of zoning codes across the country, I've found that a lot of communities say, and as our polling showed at the beginning of this webinar, many communities don't address solar in their zoning code, and they think that that's fine. We allow for solar, so it's fine. Well, it does leave your community and owners of solar energy systems, or folks who hope to install such systems, at risk for neighbors who might complain about such a system and may have nothing in the zoning code to protect those owners and the community from opposition. So as the American Planning Association Solar Briefing Paper states, a conspicuous silence on the part of local plans, policies, and regulations on the topic of solar energy constitutes a significant barrier to adoption and implementation of these technologies. So I want to just enforce the concept that silence is a barrier, and so how do we integrate and not be silent about zoning? Here are some best practices that we've gathered through the SolSmart program, and I'll touch on some of these in a little more detail moving forward. So the first concept we want to encourage in your zoning code is to create a broad and inclusive definition so that you can be addressing things like solar thermal or solar hot water heating, as well as photovoltaic installations within your definition of a solar energy system. We also encourage you to differentiate by the system area or footprint rather than capacity. So I see a lot of zoning codes where they address and differentiate based on the size of the system in terms of kilowatts. And what happens is you immediately have your zoning code becoming outdated as solar technologies improve and efficiencies increase. So this solar energy system that you're seeing on the right here, it might have been about 200 kilowatts, 8 years ago. Now it could be a whole megawatt because each one of those modules is now more efficient, and so you have more capacity on the same footprint as time goes on. So don't make your zoning code outdated as soon as you adopt these regulations by basing it on capacity, because that will change. And then we want to encourage you to differentiate between the footprint and the size of the system, as well as whether it's ground mounted or rooftop. As Brian said, these are very different land uses, and similarly, you don't want to regulate a small several panel backyard ground mounted array in the same way you would regulate a massive solar farm. So there's important aspects to consider between rooftop, ground mounted, and the footprint of the overall system. And next, one of the key components or criteria that we have in the SolSmart program is to get designation, is to require communities to allow solar as an accessory use in all major zoning districts. And you see how Garfield County, Colorado has done this in their use table here as an example. So they've differentiated between a small energy system, solar energy system, and a large one, and then an accessory use, which they have indicated is permitted in every use and district or zoning district. And another concept I want to include here is to try to regulate the impact, right? We as planners are charged with regulating in the interest of the health, safety, and welfare of our community. And I would pose to you that where electrons flow is not an arguable impact on the health, safety, and welfare of a community. So I see a lot of zoning codes where they try to regulate, understandably, they're trying to prevent big commercial systems from going in a sort of residential zone, right? But they do that by trying to say that the solar energy system shall be designed to provide energy for the property on which it is located. In doing that, you've basically tried to regulate where the electrons are flowing. And so you've prevented shared or community solar installations where it's not serving a property on which it's located. You're preventing primary solar installations, and you're also preventing innovative utility business models like the one that we're seeing here in this picture. This is a small residential home system, and it is actually owned by the utility, and it is not feeding into that home. It is not net metered. This is an example of where APS, an Arizona utility, actually owns and operates 1,500 customer-sited PV systems where it feeds directly into the grid. They're sited on the west side facing side of that house, and the utility is trying to mitigate their afternoon load by placing solar energy systems, small rooftop systems, on feeders where there's a high afternoon load. And they pay that homeowner $30 a month on their utility bill. So it's new kinds of utility business models like this that you'd be preventing with this misguided, I think, trying to regulate who gets the electrons from a system. Try to regulate the use of the roof rather than the direction these electrons are flowing. It's also, this is a mechanism that some utilities are using to extend the benefits of solar energy to low and moderate income households. And so you don't want to prevent those kind of models and programs. Another consideration in your zoning code is height and height allowances and maximums. So a best practice is to exempt rooftop mounted systems from maybe your height maximum for each zoning district, or perhaps provide an allowance of a certain amount that solar energy systems could exceed that height. It's particularly important for flat roofs. If the flat roof has already met that height maximum, or if you require things like flush mounting, which can be a good approach for aesthetic concerns, but it actually, if you require flush mounting on a flat roof, you're limiting the efficiency of that system. So rooftop fixed systems are generally installed at an angle or a tilt that is equal to their latitude to provide maximum solar energy generation. And so here you see a system that, if it had to be flush mounted, would of course not be as efficient, and it's on a flat roof. So flat roofs are a particular consideration when you're looking at height and flush mounting requirements. We also want to encourage you to have a little bit of an allowance or allow moderate encroachment into a setback so that you can remove some potential barriers to solar energy deployment in your community. And then another consideration for ground-mounted systems is lot coverage and impervious surface. So in areas where there are large lots or rural districts, you might see lot coverage limitations as little as 10% of a lot. And that's generally when it applies to a building. So if you extend those requirements to a solar energy farm, as you see in the right here is an example of a small shared solar installation for a cooperative electric utility. And it's taking up about 90% of that parcel. And so if that was limited as it would be applied to a building to 10% of that lot, you can see how it wouldn't be effective or possible even. Lot coverage is also generally involved with impervious surface. So there may be considerations there where you're trying to prevent stormwater runoff onto adjacent properties or preserve the water quality in your streams and wetlands. And so some communities will consider solar panels as completely impervious and basically treat an installation like you're looking at as a parking lot. And what happens then is you require can be up to a quarter of that area to be set aside for retention and detention of stormwater. So you'd cut out a big chunk of that when it can no longer be used for solar energy generation and has to be used for a retention pond. So that's another way to create a barrier to large-scale solar energy generation. As you can see, a facility like this, the water can flow between the modules, beneath the arrays, and to the extent that that site is vegetated, you're creating a very permeable water quality infiltration system. Aesthetics are, of course, a concern, primarily for, it depends on the community culture. But I've seen some zoning codes where they actually say that we don't want to see it from a roadway or public right-of-way. And that can be a major barrier to solar installation. It would, of course, prevent this install that you see here, which is on an affordable housing project. I've also seen where a community might fail to exempt rooftop solar from screening requirements, from rooftop mechanical appurtenances. So that's something where you want to consider, can you exempt solar from that screening requirement, especially for rooftop, because it just creates additional cost and potential shading, and make sure that you allow solar to be seen from a public right-of-way. If there are considerable aesthetic sensibilities in your community, you might want to consider rooftop flush-mounted rooftop requirements, except for, as I said, in a flat roof situation. Although aesthetic considerations are, of course, important, especially in historic and special use districts. So here, if you do not address solar, it will assume to be not allowed in a historic district. So we're encouraging folks to make sure that solar is addressed and proper guidelines are established to help folks understand how they can still install solar even in a historic district. And that might include ways to install it in such a way that it doesn't interfere with the historic facade or is visible from the street in these cases. It might also be guiding solar installs to be installed on non-historic properties or outbuildings, etc. So these are things that could be either integrated into your historic district design guidelines or perhaps into your ordinance. Okay, let's move on to land use planning for large-scale solar. Here it's a very different land use, and let's define it here. I am specifically talking about photovoltaic development, and that is PV, which converts sunlight into electricity through semiconductor materials. So we're not talking about a steam turbine. There are no mirrors involved or power towers, etc., and it's not concentrating solar, which can be a very different land use. Generally, PV requires about 5 to 7 acres per megawatt of installed capacity as a general rule of thumb. And oftentimes these facilities are not net metered or serving a particular building, so they are going to be feeding directly into the grid or a large factory, perhaps. And why is it important to plan for large-scale PV, even if you're in a more urban community? what we're seeing is under the Department of Energy's Sunshot low battery storage cost scenario, which has basically become a reality already as storage costs, this is battery, chemical battery storage costs, they are dropping precipitously. They predict that PV deployment will grow to an estimated 1,600 gigawatts by 2050. And if you consider that as in 2016, 70% of the capacity that's installed is utility scale, that means 6.6 million acres of additional land will be used for utility scale PV by that 2050 date. And that's the size of Massachusetts. And all of that, as Brian said, will be happening in our communities. So we need to plan for this. It's going to be actually the predicted lowest cost energy generation technology. So large-scale PV is predicted to drop below the current lowest cost energy generation technology, which is wind generation, within the next 5 years. So we're going to see a lot of development pressure, and let's make sure we plan for it. So Brian talked about some of the potential conflicts and with large-scale solar. There are many benefits that you can reap as well, and those include economic development, jobs and spending. Most of the jobs that you're going to see on a large-scale PV site will come during the construction phase. You can have hundreds of people during peak construction time, but that will only last for several months. And after that, these are generally unmanned facilities. So you don't have the same kinds of generation of jobs that is long-term, although there are some jobs for operation and maintenance. You also have increased local property taxes. These are major investments, but you don't have the additional services to provide for people who are working on site or living on this facility. So it is a good benefit without an added expenditure. It reduces environmental risks associated with fossil fuel energy generation, like greenhouse gas and mercury, et cetera. And it can, as Brian mentioned, provide, if developed in a low-impact way, water quality protection, habitat value, and agricultural opportunities, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So I'd like to encourage you to consider large-scale PV as its own unique kind of land use. Sometimes I see communities try to smush it into a wind ordinance, which they've already dealt with, and it is quite a different kind of land use, even than wind. But it also, sometimes I see folks consider large-scale PV as an industrial land use. And I would argue that it is not the same as an industrial land use because it doesn't come with the same kinds of nuisances that we see on industrial land, and that includes noise, traffic, and pollution. Generally, industrial land or zoned land is, you want that to be a job center, and so as we've just talked about, there's not employees on these sites necessarily. So you also run the risk of spot zoning. If you require a large-scale PV site to rezone to industrial in wherever they choose to be, then you could be creating a spot zoning situation where it's a facility that useful life will be 25 to 35 years, and when it's done, you may not want a factory coming in there or a really intense industrial land use. So it's something to consider moving forward. Similarly, large-scale PV plants are not the same as a traditional utility power plant. And so sometimes I see communities, I think, making that mistake of zoning large-scale PV as like a major utility. And they don't have similar land uses because a large-scale PV farm does not require large amounts of water for cooling and steam turbines. They don't have on-site personnel. They don't create pollution in the same way that a traditional power plant would. So I would encourage you to consider large-scale PV as a unique land use and zoning type and not throw it into these other existing categories. As Brian mentioned, there are a lot of perceived conflicts with large-scale PV in particular, and I want to try to address some of those myths. The largest or most common myth that I hear is that PV will create glare, and I see some communities making the mistake of requiring glare studies for PV installations of any size. And the fact of the matter is, and I have a blog down at the bottom here that compiles a bunch of different research that demonstrates this, PV panels are generally encased in glass with a anti-reflective coating, which makes them less reflective than windows and water. So if you're going to require a glass or a glare study, you might also need to require such a study for highly fenestrated office buildings or lakes, for example. So I would encourage you to leave the glare study up to the FAA if it is indeed on or near an airport, and that's a separate permitting consideration. These facilities are very low noise. Tracking systems do make a whir, and an inverter makes a hum, but outside the fence line, these are generally equivalent to ambient noise and certainly not a nuisance. And these are safe facilities. They all meet lots of standards for building codes, structural and electrical, and they are warranted equipment on this site. Also, sometimes folks have considerations or concerns about electromagnetic fields or EMF, and these facilities are 1,000 to 1,500 volts, and that is much lower voltage than your distribution or transmission lines that are running through your community. So not a consideration or a problem there. So as far as visual impacts, I want to encourage you to remember that what you see from the road is basically the fence and the first row of modules. These are not high-profile developments that will be highly impactful in a visual view shed like a wind turbine might be. So the fence is required for safety and security by the National Electric Code. Generally, developers will want to install a 60-inch chain link fence with 3 stands of barbed wire or raised wire, again, for safety and security. Now, if your aesthetic considerations are pretty high, then you might want to create a more significant landscape buffer or require a more decorative fence. Those can add up in the cost, so you could be precluding some installations depending on how onerous those requirements are. But also consider that some utilities and entities that are building large-scale solar, they want to show it off. So I had an incident where the utility was really proud of their system. They wanted people to see it, and the city was at the same time trying to require a landscape buffer so that people couldn't see it. So there can be some conflicting interests in that regard. All right, let's move on to some co-benefits and co-location that you can try to guide your solar energy development toward. So one opportunity is, of course, Brownfield redevelopment site. So here you're, of course, using a site that cannot be redeveloped for other uses, and it is an excellent site for solar energy generation. It is a more expensive development, and it comes with increased risks, given the risks associated with a landfill and leaching, et cetera. But this can be a way to develop otherwise undevelopable land and reap those benefits. We're also seeing increased use of water bodies. These are generally man-made impoundments for water for floating PV. Again, more expensive to develop floating PV as opposed to ground-mounted. But this is a way for particularly areas where they might have high land costs or land constraints to still capture the benefits from PV development. And so you might use a reservoir, a retention pond, or a quarry lake for these kinds of applications. Also, what you can do as a community is guide that solar development to be lower impact, to perhaps capture some co-benefits. So one way to do this is to require native grasses and forbs as your revegetation mix. And you can see the additional soil stabilization benefits that native grasses and forbs provide as opposed to turf grass. Some developers may want to gravel a site, and so you have priority and the ability as an authority having jurisdiction to require the kind of ground cover that goes into a utility scale solar system. So this might be one consideration or condition you might want to require as solar energy is developed in your community. Brian mentioned some of the pollinator-friendly requirements that we've seen. We have 4 states now that I'm aware of that have created state-enabling legislation with solar or pollinator-friendly solar farm standards. And then he mentioned Stearns County, which is one of 2 counties that I'm aware of that have required implementation of those standards for large-scale development in their communities. There's also the Oregon Land Conservation and Development Regulations, where the state is trying to preserve prime agricultural soils. And so they're worried about loss of those soils. And so let's talk about some ways that they can actually preserve both agricultural production and benefits, as well as have solar energy development, which, as Brian mentioned, can help diversify income for farmers and ranchers and create a more stable, predictable income to actually preserve that farming opportunity. All right, so NREL and Argonne National Laboratories have collaborated to do some studies on the potential impact of pollinator-friendly development on solar farms or ground cover. And we found that if 10 to 50% of existing and planned solar energy facilities used pollinator-friendly habitat and ground cover, they could actually produce 1.9 to 5.7 billion in pollination benefit annually. And so that includes the offset costs of paying for pollinators to come to your agricultural site. It also includes increased crop yields from pollinator services. And those are particularly helpful in areas where there are highly pollinator-dependent crops like almonds, cranberries, melons, apples, blueberries, etc. We did a case study here in Minnesota where we looked at one solar facility. If that solar facility installed pollinator-friendly vegetation, then within the bee foraging area where there are pollinator-dependent crops, as you can see in yellow, we estimate that even with a hypothetical 1% pollinator service increase benefit, you could see thousands of dollars of increased economic production and benefit to that area. So beyond the benefits of things like low impact solar development, you can also have co-location of solar and agricultural production. And here is a simple example of an apiary. So you not only do you have the pollinator-friendly vegetation, but you might also have honey production on your solar farm. You can also have sheep, particularly in non-arid areas, as your vegetation management approach. And so this is particularly common in North Carolina as well as Hawaii and growing in some other areas. These are sheep that are raised for meat. You can see that they don't have horns. You can't do goats because they jump up on things and they eat everything. And cattle, I've been asked a lot, can we still graze our cattle on the solar farm? And the answer is no. They rub up against the panels and they tend to create problems. But solar farms and sheep grazing tends to be very compatible and as a co-benefit for meat production from sheep. We're also studying the use of actual row crops and hand-picked crops underneath solar arrays. Now, we found that, and this is a test case in Massachusetts, the yield of these hand-picked crops does not diminish significantly even though they're within the shade of the panels. However, you can see that these kinds of installations have a little bit more, less density and a lot more cost for the racking as opposed to something that's more dense like a traditional solar install. So we're still exploring those options, but there are many ways to have co-benefits and co-uses of your land, and you can guide that through your local development code and plans. So in summary, we want to encourage you to consider your solar resource and recognize that within your comprehensive plan, to establish solar goals and objectives in your comp plan, and then use your zoning and land use code to help achieve those goals. And ways to integrate solar appropriately include differentiating between rooftop and ground-mounted PV, and as well as small and large-scale PV, and applying appropriate regulations to those different kinds of categories. And then there's other options to consider for attracting beneficial solar development, including expediting permit review, which SolSmart can help you with as far as technical assistance, and also lowering permitting fees, expediting permitting processes and timeframes, and then property tax and sales tax exemptions can also help create an incentive, and providing clarity on how systems will be taxed, as well as considering ground cover standards and PV and agricultural co-benefits. So that is it for me. I am now going to change over to Michael, and we will take a lot of your questions, which I'm looking forward to. Thanks so much for your time and attention.
Great. Thank you very much, Megan, Brian, and Scott. I think this has been a great conversation here. We've gotten a number of questions since we started here, so I'm going to go ahead and start asking you them, and we'll have some conversation here till the end of the half hour. And then if you want to continue to send in questions, please do so, and we will go ahead and ask them of the panelists. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question about SolSmart, since that's where we began. What benefit would I receive by our city joining SolSmart? I have a professional staff that can write codes. We already allow single-family residents or businesses to get solar panels within a simple business building permit, but what would you recommend?
Yeah, there's numerous reasons to join SolSmart. I think one of the large draws is the no-cost technical assistance, and that's where the TA provider can actually examine everything that you guys currently have in your solar environment and see where there's actually areas for improvement. So while you still may allow solar, there might still be other barriers that you're unaware of, and the TA can help address those and provide solutions to help address any issues that might exist.
This is Brian, and I just want to add that kind of some of the stuff that Megan was just going over, the latest research about how solar can, and in some cases can't, create synergies with the land uses is not something always that the staff of an existing city or county has kept abreast of. So there is a lot of value in the technical assistance on some fairly complex kind of solar questions. As well as, I think, some finance questions about how to actually do installations and spec them out and create RFPs.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, can a municipality still become a solar-ready community if net-metered solar installations are preempted from zoning, as in Vermont?
I don't think that the SolSmart program precludes or punishes local communities for state statutes. So we have taken into consideration both state statutes like in California that enable or require certain standards to be met, but also I think we wouldn't penalize local governments from gaining SolSmart recognition and designation based on a state statute. So that's a good question.
And I do believe we have some designees in Vermont already, so I don't believe we penalize them for that.
Yeah, and I think that we have other instances where state law sometimes precludes local governments from acting in certain ways, but I'm not aware of any of those instances where that precluded someone from being certified in SolSmart.
Okay. Another question. Can one of you address incentives to guide solar siting away from our best farmland and forest and toward previously developed land?
Yeah, well, Megan, do you want to start there?
Sure, I can start. Feel free to add. So that is a good question. You can take a lot of different routes. You can try to create solar incentive areas like Brian showed that they have in Arizona and County to try to direct that development. You do have to recognize that development on brownfields or gray fields is more expensive and may not be large enough. There might not be interconnection opportunities there. So you might be increasing the cost of solar energy generation in your community by requiring it to be on likely smaller parcels and more infill parcels. But you can develop it by creating incentive areas. You can also add a lot of conditions to development outside of the areas where you're targeting development. You can also create standards for low impact development, make sure that those large scale systems are actually providing buffer and water quality benefits to your more natural areas. And You can require things like a view shed study if you're really concerned about aesthetics, and require that there not be impacts on things like view sheds, etc. So those are some ideas. Brian, you got some others?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of emphasize one thing that is people say, how do we keep solar off of these areas? And my first question to communities in that instance is always, do you have regulations in place that keep other forms of development off those areas? If you're trying to protect farmland, do you actually have a farmland preservation ordinance or statute that you're following? And I know sometimes this happens at the state level, but we don't want to regulate the placement of solar gardens, for instance, by preventing them from going on prime farm soils, but allowing houses to go on prime farm soils. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. You're actually better off in terms of protection of your farmland resource by putting a solar garden on with pollinator habitat or some kind of native planting that's going to build the soil content, that at least at the end of that solar installation's lifetime, you can decommission it and turn it back into farmland. You're never going to do that with housing. So kind of the first standard you have to say when that question comes up is, if we want to protect our farmland, or we want to protect these natural areas, are we in fact already protecting them? And how does solar development fit into that concept? So that's, and then in that regard, if in fact you are already doing it, then that's the place at which you start and say, how does solar development actually achieve the protection goal, specific protection goal that you're trying to get to? If you want to protect forested land in your community, you can say no solar. You cannot remove more than X number of acres of trees in order to do development. And I would emphasize, provided that's consistent with your other kinds of development. If you're going to allow someone to go in and knock down 30 acres of trees in order to do a subdivision, well, what's the difference between that and a solar garden going in there? And from the standpoint of tree preservation, if you don't allow your housing development to do that, then you should also not allow your solar development to do that. And that's a very simple and straightforward thing to go through, I think.
Okay. On a similar vein, what about the balance between promoting solar and residential and those areas that are promoting the planting of large deciduous shade trees close to houses for shade during summertime? Is there a way to balance between providing rooftop solar panels and roof gardens, or shade-tolerant ground cover under elevated solar panels?
There seemed to be a lot in that question. So what?
Well, I guess the question is similar to in some ways what you're talking about previously about balancing in areas where we want to encourage residential rooftop solar, and also where we may be encouraging the planting of trees. Is there examples or areas where ways of thinking about kind of balancing both of those things that enable them both to occur?
Yeah, okay. That's a good question, and one that we do see, and it's not always an easy thing, and it does depend to some extent on the kind of what habitat you're talking about and what kind of trees you're talking about. If you can plant species of trees that will not shade rooftop solar because they'll stay shorter than the shading and the shading height for that system. You can specify those kinds of trees or create some kind of an incentive for them. You can also provide some flexibility, greater flexibility for solar to be developed, for instance, in side yards or other kinds of places where you might not want to allow it in order to avoid the shading issue. So you can, in most urban areas now, at least larger urban areas, you can get a good sense of rooftops that already have solar access and those that don't on the the Google Sunroof program, in case if you aren't aware of that. And that will show you kind of where your existing rooftop systems are and where the risk is in terms of tree planting. Of course, if you plant a new tree today, you're not going to end up with a shading situation for a rooftop system for a number of years. But you do need to think about that to some extent, because it will create a conflict. And there's a whole series of tools to use around solar access. I'm not a big fan of solar access zoning, but there are some examples of how it is used in certain places very successfully. So there's a whole realm of resources that SolSmart can provide you with around that.
Okay. Here's a question about the planning process. Do you need to engage local electric distributors during the comprehensive plan process regarding collection network and transmission lines?
Oh, that's a great question. I am one of the big gaps we have right now in terms of solar deployment planning is that the electric utilities look at the capacity on their system or where they have hosting capacity for new systems, whether they be rooftop or principal use gardens or farms, and identify where they have capacity and then they kind of stop there without considering that maybe the areas where they have capacity are the areas where the city or the county doesn't want to do solar. And the places that they do want to do solar are the places where there's not hosting capacity. And there needs to be a matching of those two planning processes. We have a lot of utilities that are now starting to engage in distribution system planning, and it is to the local government's advantage to make sure that these issues come up from the standpoint of local government. That local government has an interest in where the utilities actually make infrastructure investments that will enable solar and where they don't. This is just like any other kind of infrastructure issue. You don't want someone building, you don't want the county coming in and building a road through your city that's going to allow for development to occur in an area that you wanted to protect. You don't want to extend regional wastewater infrastructure in places where you have set a farmland preservation goal. And it's the same kind of infrastructure issues that needs to be married up, and we're just starting to scratch the surface on this.
I would add that when you're looking at large-scale solar, the developers are going to want to develop around an existing substation. So that's a consideration in your land use planning, that you can anticipate if you have open land around substations that it might be a highly desirable location for large-scale solar interconnection and development.
Okay, we've been getting a lot more questions in here as we're having this conversation. Here's another question. Given the need for PV acreage, how should we encourage industrial building designs to incorporate solar on their roofs? Are there other building code and roof design issues that need to be considered?
Yes, there is solar-ready construction. So that would include both wiring a building, a new building in general, to easily adapt or incorporate a solar energy system. There's also things like what I did when I put on a small addition to my cottage, and that is putting all the rooftop penetrations for venting on the north-facing side of the roof. So if you have a pitched roof, or you can cluster them if it's a flat roof so that they're not completely spread out over every inch of the roof and precluding or shading any kind of solar installation. Brian, do you have other thoughts?
I think that's exactly the right point. And there are, I just wanted to point out, there are standards for solar-ready construction. You don't have to figure it out yourself. There are already people who have done it for you about what that means. You can merely say in your industrial and commercial development that new buildings have to meet an existing solar-ready construction standard. And those include all the things that Megan talked about. And you can also, kind of to add to that, you can exempt people if they actually don't have a solar resource, which in some cases they won't. Usually for a commercial or industrial building, they're going to be big enough that they will have a solar resource. But it is really important that the architect think about this from the standpoint on commercial buildings of the rooftop equipment that is going to go on there. So there's, you have things like plumbing vents and those kinds of penetrations, but you also have a whole lot of rooftop HVAC and ventilation that goes up, and kind of making sure that that is designed in a way to preserve a space for the solar resource so that it can be easily put on there will help kind of move your solar development maybe from ground mount over to the industrial spots where that's like the perfect mix of land uses.
Okay. Here's a more specific question. What section of the comp plan would be appropriate for this discussion? In the natural resources section or some other portion of the plan?
That's a good question, and it does. I've wrestled with this for quite a bit on a number of communities where we kind of looked to put it in. The dilemma we encounter is that there are certain parts of a solar friendly or solar ready comp plan that need to address, economic development. You need to address housing. You need to address natural resources. You may need to address things like farmland protection, and those may all be in different sections of your comp plan. We do have some comp plans that are starting to incorporate, for instance, resilience sections in them, and sometimes that's a good place to centralize your solar as long as you recognize that there are kind of tendrils that flow out into these other areas. I'm not a big fan of putting the solar development part of your comp plan into the natural resource section, because that tends to treat solar only as an environmental benefit rather than an economic benefit as well, and that may become ultimately the bigger issue. Not to diminish the environmental benefit at all. That's kind of, I have to admit, where I kind of got involved in the solar industry because of that benefit. But nevertheless, think about how it fits into all these sections. I would prefer to see it in the land use section, if you have one that's separate from the other sections, and also to make sure there's some mention of it in the housing section.
Okay. Kind of an infrastructure question. Is it fair to assume that solar arrays could last longer than 25 to 35 years and not be a temporary land use? If not, why not?
Yes. It's fair to assume that. So what solar modules do is they degrade, or they become, they lose some of their ability to generate solar energy or electricity over time, but it only degrades at 0.5% a year. And so at the end of, you have solar panels that have generally a 25-year warranty. At the end of that 25 years, they're still generating at least 80% of their original capacity. And that's pretty valuable, particularly if you've paid off the upfront capital costs to just sell onto the market. So yes, it can be a little bit misleading to say it's really just a 25-year lifetime, but it is still a temporary use in that you can decommission fairly easily and cost effectively and reuse that site for something else. However, I think what you will probably see, given the infrastructure that is already there and the interconnection, is probably repowering. So once those solar modules are not efficient enough and it makes financial sense to switch them out with the latest technology, they will likely be repowered like we're seeing in the wind industry with new, more efficient modules. They might actually have to replace the racking too, because it might rust out after a while. But that facility is very likely to be repowered or reused for solar energy generation moving forward. However, that's not to say that you can set a time limit on a conditional or special use permit generally that would only allow that use for a certain period of time. You want to probably extend it beyond that first 25 years to allow a tail end generation that will make that facility more cost effective in the long term and help recapture the upfront capital costs. But yeah, you will probably see a lot of repowering, just like we're seeing wind turbines being replaced after 8 years or so, or 10 years, with larger, taller, more efficient turbines.
And I think that Megan is exactly right. That there's an economic incentive to repower, because one of the most valuable things that site will have is an existing interconnection point with the utility. And that's going to be very valuable to the solar owner. However, to also kind of emphasize what another point that Megan made is that to some extent this is the community's decision. So the community can issue an interim use permit that the developer will likely accept, to set the limit at 25 or 30 years or something like that. And at that point in time, it becomes the community's choice whether or not they issue another permit and repower, or they decide to decommission. So that's the advantage that you have. Obviously, the developer, I think, in most cases is going to want, or the owner of the site is going to want to repower at that point. However, the option still lies in the community's, still lies with the community.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we're really running out of time, but I did want to ask a couple last questions here so that we can close out the conversation. It seems there would be an advantage to install or incorporate solar arrays in the construction of large buildings. Are there design standards or prototypes that we could share with commercial and industrial developers?
Yes, SolSmart offers some resources on solar-ready construction and standards for your building codes, so we can definitely provide some help there.
Okay. And then we have a question here. So if we are running an air photo or LiDAR contract, should we specify something in particular to get the solar resource information captured?
Sorry, I'm stumbling. The quick answer is no. If you're running LiDAR, they're going to capture everything that you need. You just need to make sure that you have access to the. I'm sorry. This is outside my technical realm. The first return, or whatever the LiDAR term is for that, so that you get the 3D image of the landscape in order to do the LiDAR analysis. But you don't have to ask for anything additional to that landscape, because really what you're doing with LiDAR is you're creating a shading analysis. So anything that's going to cast shade is what you want to capture.
Okay, thank you. I think we've run out of time here, and I really thank the presenters for providing really great information here, and for everybody who submitted questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org in the next couple of days. You'll be able to find it on our webinar archive page. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our weekly e-newsletter for details on future webinars. Our next webinar, also in coordination with ICMA, is Connecting Data to Action, Tools for Building Cross-Sector Partnerships, which will take place on March 11th, and we'll be posting the link to register on that soon. So hope everybody has a great day, and thank you again for participating.